Okay, the story of Reuben Hurricane Carter, the reason I just gave you the notes is it's a little difficult to understand in a lecture, but it is a great story. And remember when we go back to 1966 at a glance, we told you about the two men and the woman that were killed at the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey? Well, let's move on to the story of Reuben Hurricane Carter. And I'm going to kind of read this but try to explain it to you as well. In mid-June of 1966, Reuben Hurricane Carter and a fellow by the name of John Artis were questioned by police concerning those three murders that occurred in Paterson, New Jersey. And at the time, Reuben Carter was a professional boxer who was the #1 contender for the middleweight boxing crown. In other words, there was a champion, but he was the #1 contender. He was the guy that was going to get the next title shot against the middleweight champion. And he had a very fast punch to him, etc. So his nickname was the Hurricane in the boxing world. Artis was just a young black man who just happened to give Carter a ride home early the morning of the murders. So he was maybe someone that was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, on October 14th of 1966, a witness by the name of Alfred P. Bellow gave New Jersey police a signed statement claiming that he saw Reuben Carter and John Artis at the June 17th murder scene. And so the next day, on October 15th, Carter and Artis were arrested for the triple murder that took place in that New Jersey tavern. Then on May 27th of 1967, after a long period and trial, an all-white jury convicted Carter and Artis, and the two men were sentenced to prison for 3 life terms apiece, one for each of the murders. Well, in prison, Carter wrote a book after 7 years, and in September of 1974, Carter's book was published by Viking Press, and the book was entitled The 16th Round. Okay? Now I would just challenge you to get on eBay and first of all see if you could find one of these, and secondly see what they go for. Okay? Now this is a weird deal and I'm off task, but I bought this on a chance for like 30 bucks, and here's the inscription inside the book, and I want you to tell me what you think it means. Okay? I just happened to buy this and it was inscripted inside the book. Okay? It says, "To a man who has dedicated his life to the eradication of injustice and suffering, my hope is that this book will reinforce your efforts to help others who have had the opportunity to, have had to bear the yoke of oppression. Your son, Chip." Who does that sound like it's written to? Huh? No? It sounds like it's written to Hurricane Carter by his son, doesn't it? But I can't get any evidence that his son's name is Chip, but I have no idea what that means. So I'm wondering if I hit the jackpot here. But anyway, the book is called The 16th Round, and we'll get into the importance of it in a minute. But if you go and look for that book, it's very rare, hard to find. Worth anywhere from, if you can find one, if people know what they're doing, $500 to $1,500 for that book. Okay? Now, so the book was entitled The 16th Round. That same month, Bellow, now who was Bellow again? What's that?
Or the guy that signed the witness statement.
Right, the guy who testified against him. That same month that the book was published, Bellow and another guy by the name of Arthur Bradley state that they were pressured by detectives to give false testimony. Okay? They also stated that they were offered $10,000 in reward money and promised of lenient treatment in criminal charges pending against them. 8 years later, in May of 1975, Carter sends a copy of his book to singer Bob Dylan because of Dylan's commitment to the civil rights struggle. And in July of 1975, Dylan writes a song entitled The Hurricane. And he records the song on July 30th and performs it for the first time on television on September 10th, 1975. In November, the single of the song, The Hurricane, is released, and Dylan begins a benefit tour with all proceeds going to Carter's Defense Fund, okay, because they're going to try to appeal this decision. On March 17, 1976, the New Jersey Supreme Court unanimously overturns Carter's conviction. And the court ruled that the prosecution withheld evidence favorable to the defense, and ordered a new trial. On December 22nd, 1976, the second trial occurred. Prosecuting lawyers argued that Carter committed the murders for racial revenge. The bar where the murders were committed would not allow blacks to be served at the time. So Carter is reconvicted and given the same life sentences, and he returns back to prison. Well, this is kind of an interesting story. In 1979, a special relationship begins between Carter and a young black teenager by the name of Lesra Martin. Martin was 15. He was essentially illiterate. He was trying to survive in the ghetto in Brooklyn, New York. His parents knew he wasn't going to get a very good education or a fair shake in life there. So he was taken from the ghetto with the permission of the parents, and 3 Canadian free spirits, basically they were hippies if you wanted to call them at that time, by the name of Lisa, Sam, and Terry, offered to take Lesra and educate him. His parents agreed to that because they knew he was going nowhere with them in Brooklyn. So the 3 took him to a book sale one day, and he paid 25 cents for this book, The 16th Round. It was the first book that Lesra Martin ever attempted to even read in his lifetime. Bought it for 25 cents. He was consumed by the book, and he eventually wrote Reuben Carter a letter in prison. Carter was touched by the letter, and he responded back to Lesra, and a moving relationship began between the two. Well, Lisa, Sam, and Terry, who I don't know a lot about them, they must have been kind of trust babies. You know what trust babies are, where parents have a lot of money and they just kind of give them money to go away, so to speak. And I think that they had some time and some money, so they decided to take on Carter's legal case, and they even moved to New Jersey so they could study his arrest, his trials, and conviction. Now, with their efforts and others that chipped in, Carter was giving a third hearing in November of 1985. And on November 7th, 1985, Judge H. Lee Sorokin of Federal Court in Newark, New Jersey, overturned the second trial convictions. And he ruled after discovering that the prosecution committed what he stated grave constitutional violations, and that the convictions of Carter and Artis were based on racism rather than reason, and concealment rather than disclosure. So the state of New Jersey appealed all the way to the Supreme Court in an effort to have Carter return to prison for a third time. And on January 11th, 1988, the Supreme Court upheld Judge Sorokin's decision to set Reuben Carter free. He was in prison, kids, 22 years as an innocent man. 22 years, okay? After that trial, Terry, Sam, and Lisa returned to Canada, and Reuben Carter joined them there and now makes his home in Toronto. He works as the executive director of the Association of Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. And in 1993, the World Boxing Council awarded Reuben Hurricane Carter the World Middleweight Championship belt in recognition of his 22-year fight for freedom, an honor that has never been bestowed on any other fighter outside the ring in professional boxing history. Now, did he go defend that title and all that? No, because he was too old to do that. But he was given the crown that people thought it was taken from him. Lesra Martin graduated from high school. This is a kid that was basically illiterate at 15. Graduated from high school at the University of Toronto, completed his master's degree, and is a lawyer in Vancouver, Washington. Can you believe that? Now think about that. How do you pay back a man that you took 22 years of his life in prison? You guys are mainly 17, 18 years old, 19. Add 22 to your age, and from this day on, until you're 40 years old, you're not going to be in society. You're going to be in prison doing nothing but being in prison and be wrongly accused and be in prison for that long. Can you imagine that? That I'm going to take you to prison today for something you didn't do, and I'm going to let you out when you're 40. How would you ever repay a person for that? How would you do that? So it came out to be such an inspiring story that Denzel Washington starred as Reuben Hurricane Carter in the movie The Hurricane. If you ever get a chance to see this, if you're bored on a Saturday night and you're thinking about something to do, get some kids together, friends together, and watch this. This is a great story. And what I'm not telling you, what you're not seeing, are examples of how the police department was so corrupt and how they tried their best to keep this man in prison because of their racial discrimination and the fact that they would have looked bad. It was really a crime. But, you know, Reuben Hurricane Carter kept his head up and went along. He's spoken in many different places and been a real positive piece of society. However, 22 years of his life he sat in prison. That's a long time. You guys aren't even 22 years old yet. Think about that. Anyway, this is a pretty cool piece here. That is part of the song of the Hurricane by Bob Dylan that is signed by Reuben Hurricane Carter. So that's one of my better possessions. Okay? All right, well, you can just kind of go from there. We probably won't ask you a lot on the test about this particular story, but I did want you to know the story and be aware of what happened to this man. Okay? All right, let's move on then to the Apollo space program. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain the program and then tell you about a very important flight, which was Apollo 8. Okay? So the Apollo space program. So we've had the Mercury program, right? We've had the Gemini program, and now we're moving into the space program called Apollo. Now this would be the program, the space program that would carry man to the moon. So this would be known as the moon landing program, so to speak. So Apollo was the United States space program that would carry man to the moon. Now 1961 is when the Apollo space program began, and the program ended in 1975. So it went for almost 15 years. So the Apollo space program lasted over a decade. Beginning preparations for Apollo were 1961, and it ended in 1975. Now, each of these Apollo missions during this time carried 3 astronauts. And in moon landing missions, in which there was more than one, in moon landing missions, 2 of the astronauts went to the moon and 1 stayed above the moon with the command module. How you doing?
Good. I was going to you should have my resume that I sent.
Oh, you know what? I probably erased it because
Oh,
I
you
sent it to Andy and then she
Okay.
just forwarded it to me.
Okay, yeah, I can, this is my stuff.
Oh, okay.
It's not for you.
All right, well, when I get done with this, I'll head down to Catholic Church and get some more confessions.
Okay, yeah, sounds good, sounds good.
Okay, do you want to resend
yeah,
that?
I'll resend it.
Okay, and I'll get, yeah, but do you want me to invest anybody in particular, these guys here?
Yeah, probably,
Okay.
well, no, because just in case, I'll
Okay.
send it out.
Do you want me to include your outstanding reffing ability in that?
Obviously.
Okay.
Yeah.
My back's still sore from carrying him last night.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, so cool, Zito.
hello there. When they took 3 astronauts on a Apollo mission on moon landings, keep in mind that 2 of them are going to end up landing on the moon, and 1 is going to stay above the moon in the command module, so they can successfully get away, so to speak. Okay? Now, I don't know if you knew this or not. You know how many astronauts have landed on the lunar surface? You probably heard of 2, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, maybe, the first moon landing. You know how many astronauts have actually stood on the moon? 12. 12. I bet, that's kind of, I don't think a lot of people would believe that. 12 astronauts have actually landed on the lunar surface in the career of Apollo. Okay? Now, the Apollo rocket, as it sat on the launch pad, was known as Saturn V. That's on your ID sheet. And this is a poor example. It's the best one I have. This is an example of what a Saturn V rocket looks like. Okay?
Aww, that is so cute.
Yeah, it's a little bigger than this, but you notice this is how it sits on the launch pad. But the 3 parts or modules actually are just in the very tip up here. So all of this stuff here is just simply to get the capsule into space, and then it separates, and all you're going to end up in space is just this very top part. Okay, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. So there were 3 parts of this Saturn V. The command module, the service module, and the lunar module.
Thank you.
Okay, how about this? You know what this is? This is the very top of that Saturn V. Okay, now let me explain this to you. The command module is this part right here at the top where the astronauts are housed. Okay? The service module is the part from here to here. And in moon landings, the lunar module is inside of there. And it looks like kind of like a caterpillar that comes down and lands on the moon. Okay? You'll see one of those in the National Air and Space Museum. It's pretty cool. So this is just the very top of what we call the Saturn V rocket. And again, you have the command module, you have the service module, which is part here, and then in a moon landing, the lunar module is inside the service module. Okay? Pretty cool, huh? Now, we'll tell you what each one is used for, and we'll start with the command module. And again, that's just this part right here on the top. Okay? The command module. Basically fairly small, a 3-seat capsule, obviously 1 seat for each person. So the command module was a small 3-seat capsule, and basically was the living quarters and control center for the astronauts. Okay, where they stayed, because they're going to be in space more than one day, where they're going to sleep, where all the controls are, where they're going to eat, etc. So it's the living quarters, and also considered the control center for the astronauts, where all the buttons are. Okay? This also is what's going to return to Earth's surface, only that part. And you will see the original Apollo 11 command module in the National Air and Space Museum, the exact one that went to the moon and back. It's pretty cool. So that's the command module. It is the small 3-seat capsule. It's the living quarters and control center for the astronauts, and it's also the module that returns the astronauts back to Earth. Okay? Okay, the service module, which is simply this section behind the command module. Basically, that's where the engines are. Okay, that's where the engines are, and the thrusters. Okay? The engines are located in the service module and the thrusters. What does the thruster do? Anybody know what the thruster does?
Boost flow.
It controls the craft's flight. Okay? It's kind of like the steering wheel to a point. Okay? Although it isn't a steering wheel. So the service module is behind the capsule, and it carries engines along with thrusters that are going to control the craft's flight. It also is the section of the aircraft that provides electricity, oxygen, and water to the command module. Okay, so the life support systems of the astronauts is actually in the service module. Okay, the electricity for the unit, the oxygen that's provided to the astronauts in flight, and the water is all in the service module. Okay? Also, your communications equipment and fuel are in the service module. Communications equipment and fuel. Does anybody, jumping ahead, know what the problem was in Apollo 13? It was in the service module. You know what happened? They stirred the oxygen tanks to kind of get them going, and it ended up doing what? Shorting, and they were losing oxygen. Well, you don't live long in space without oxygen. That's why they had to make the emergency. They didn't land on the moon and actually tried to get back to Earth, and we'll talk about that. Okay, the lunar module. That's basically the module that's inside the service module that would take the 2 astronauts down to the lunar surface and then back up. Okay? So if you're looking at the moon here, okay, what's going to happen is this. I'm just going to go, I've gotten trouble drawing. My drawing is not good. But anyway, what's going to happen is this is going to open up, and the lunar module, which looks kind of like a caterpillar, is going to go down to the Earth's surface and land. Okay? And the command module pilot is not going to the moon. He is staying up here and circling the moon, and then when they get done with their projects on the moon, the lunar module will then jettison them up, they'll dock, okay, and they will re-enter the spacecraft. Because what's going to happen is when they rendezvous, we talked about this, they're gonna open up this and they're gonna take out the lunar module, and the lunar module is gonna come around and dock with the front of the command module, and the astronauts are gonna go into the lunar module that way. And then it's gonna go down to the moon, do their thing, then when it comes back up, it's gonna dock again. The astronauts are gonna go back into the command module, then they're gonna jettison the lunar module, okay, out, and then it usually ends up in space, or maybe the gravity of the moon will take it down, okay? That's how it works. Now, on 3 of the Apollo missions, not Apollo 11, the first one, but on 3, the mission carried an LRV with it as well. An LRV. Anybody want to guess what that stands for?
It's a rover.
Lunar Roving Vehicle. And basically what it was is a 4-wheeled moon buggy that allowed the astronauts to explore more of the moon's surface. Okay? On the first moon landing, they didn't spend a bunch of time down there. Okay? But as Apollo flights continued to the moon, they even got into these LRVs, or lunar roving vehicles, and actually drove around the surface of the moon when they had more time. Okay? So 3 of the Apollo missions carried an LRV, or lunar roving vehicle, which was a 4-wheeled moon buggy that enabled the astronauts to actually explore more of the moon. 3 of the Apollo missions we had during this time circled the moon without landing. So 3 of the Apollo missions circled the moon without landing. And the first moon landing was Apollo 11 on July 20th, 1969. And we'll talk more about that in detail later. So the first moon landing for Apollo was Apollo 11, and it landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Same day I had my appendix out. True story. July 20th, 1969. Dr. Whitney, Forsyth, Montana, took out my appendix and the day man landed on the moon. True story. Now, during these moon landings, astronauts actually collected 842 pounds of rocks and other samples. So they did bring that type of thing back to Earth. They also transmitted data back to Earth from the moon. You know, they also took photographs and measured different things on the moon and brought information back. So the reason was to research, transmit data. They also collected during the Apollo missions 842 pounds of rocks and other samples. Now, unfortunately, Apollo did not get off to a great start, because in Apollo 1, we had a terrible disaster on Apollo 1, the first Apollo flight. And that was scheduled for launch on February 21st, 1967. So the Apollo program suffered an early disaster, as Apollo 1 was scheduled for launch on February 21st, 1967. And what are all these Apollo missions lined up to do? What are they preparing for? The moon landing, okay? Well, on January 27th, about 3 weeks before the scheduled launch, astronauts Roger Chaffee, who's on your ID sheet, Gus Grissom, Virgil Gus Grissom, who we've talked about before in both the Mercury and the Gemini flights, and Edward H. White II, who flew Gemini 6A, remember? The dock that helped do the rendezvous with Lovell and Borman. Well, Roger Chaffee, Virgil Gus Grissom, and Edward H. White II were the 3 astronauts that were scheduled to take off in Apollo 1. Okay? Roger Chaffee, Virgil Gus Grissom, and Edward H. White II, 2 of the 3 we've talked about, were the astronauts on Apollo 1. Roger Chaffee, who's on your ID sheet, Gus Grissom, and Edward White II. Well, during a routine preparation, a spark ignited inside the command module as it sat on the liftoff pad and burnt those 3 astronauts to death. I mean, it was a terrible thing. They couldn't get out, and they basically burnt to death on the launch pad on January 27, 1967. So they're doing a launch pad test. The command module started on fire inside as a result of a short and took the lives of Chaffee, Grissom, and White. There's a picture of the three astronauts right between the Janis Joplin and the Woodstock posters there right above the door. Those are the three astronauts of Apollo 1.
January what?
27th is the date in which they were killed. Now, the last ever Apollo flight in 1975 was actually not a mission to the moon. Anybody want to guess what we did in that particular mission? Anybody want to guess what we did?
Is that when we put up the Hubble telescope?
No. No. We performed an orbital rendezvous with who? The Soviet Union. Very good. So the last Apollo mission launched on July 15th, 1975. And what happened in that is the United States and the Soviet Union successfully linked up in space. Boy, was that a first? What do you think John Kennedy would have thought about that in 1961? When we were worried about the race for space. So on July 15th, 1975, the last Apollo mission ever, went into space and docked, linked up with a Soviet spaceship. Okay, I could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different Apollo missions. We will go in detail on Apollo 11, but there is no Apollo 11 without Apollo 8. And that's what we're going to talk about to finish up this test material. So our last subtopic is Apollo 8. And again, I want to reemphasize, there's no Apollo 11 without Apollo 8. Okay, Apollo 8 was launched on December 21st, 1968 at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Apollo 8 was launched on December 21st, 1968 at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. December 21st, 1968, 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Again, how many astronauts are going to be in this Apollo mission? 3. 2 of them are familiar. It would be commanded by Frank Borman. Frank Borman would be the commander of Apollo 8. Who's the command module pilot? We talked about already. New signature, just got it. Jim Lovell. Remember, they were partners in Gemini 7. So in Apollo 8, Frank Borman is the commander of the mission. Jim Lovell was command module pilot. So we got an overall commander, we got a lunar module, or excuse me, I gave it away. We have a command module pilot. What we need is a lunar module pilot. The pilot that's going to take the lunar module to the moon. And that was William Anders. William Anders. So the astronauts in Apollo 8 are Commander Frank Borman, command module pilot Jim Lovell, and lunar module pilot William Anders. Now this is not going to be a moon landing, it's going to be a preparation. So if it was a moon landing, who would not be going to the moon? Jim Lovell, okay? Because he's the command module pilot. He would be staying in space circling the moon, okay? Well, that'll bring up a point. Now, there were 4 reasons they sent Apollo 8 on its mission. They wanted to demonstrate command and service module performance. They wanted to demonstrate command and service module performance. What does that mean? They wanted to demonstrate that the lunar module, or excuse me, the service module and the command module were doing what? Working properly, okay? Oxygen was getting to the astronauts, electricity, the whole 9 yards we talked about. So one of the purposes of Apollo 8 is to demonstrate that the command module and the service module performed properly. Second thing Apollo 8 was for was to evaluate crew performance in a lunar orbit mission. What's a lunar orbit mission? What? They're going to orbit the moon. Has that ever been done? Now, if Apollo 11 is going to work, are they going to have to be able to orbit the moon? Slingshot around the moon? Okay? So that was the second thing, to evaluate the crew's performance in a lunar orbit mission, getting around the moon. The third thing it was set up to do was to demonstrate communication and tracking at lunar distances. Demonstrate communication and tracking at lunar distances. What does that mean? Houston, we don't have a problem, okay? They want to make sure that the Apollo missions can communicate from the moon and they can track them from the moon. Because have we ever had anybody that far yet? No, okay? And what do you think the fourth thing is? Because they're not going to land in Apollo 8, but they're preparing for Apollo 11. So what are they looking for? What are they taking pictures of? Possible landing spots on the moon for Apollo 11. So the mission was to demonstrate command module and service module performance. 2, to evaluate the crew performance in a lunar orbit mission. 3, to demonstrate communications and tracking at a distance from the Earth to the moon, or lunar distances. And 4, to return high-resolution photography of possible landing areas on the moon. Okay? Do we know anything about the moon? Really? No. Now, I talked to you about the what I do with my famous Saturn V rocket. Look at this baby. Apollo 8 was the first manned Apollo flight to use this entire contraption, Saturn V. The rest of them were set up differently. So Saturn V rocket was used for the very first time with Apollo 8. And it was a little risky because we ever shot up a rocket with that kind of power before? No. Okay, now again, in Apollo 8, since there was no moon landing, the lunar module was not jettisoned into space. We simply had the command module and the service module. There was no lunar module inside. They didn't need to take it because they weren't landing on the moon. So, they take off, and at 68 hours, 58 minutes, and 45 seconds, there was a loss of signal between Apollo 8 and Mission Control in Houston. So, they took off, and 68 hours, 58 minutes, and 45 seconds after takeoff, they lost the signal between Apollo 8 and Mission Control at NASA. Why? How'd they lose that?
They were going around the moon.
They were on the dark side of the moon. Pink Floyd. Okay, so for the first time in American history, Borman, Lovell, and Anders become the first humans to see the dark side or the far side of the moon. No one had ever been there before because they lost communication because they were directly behind the dark side of the moon. You might want to listen to that song and see if it has anything to do with that, okay?
No.
Okay. During this mission, there were 6 telecasts between the astronauts on Apollo 8 and Earth. What are 6 telecasts? Is that video or audio? Audio, okay? Now, when did they take off? Kaylee, go back and tell me the day they took off. So what's coming up in their mission? Christmas. So on Christmas Eve, the crew read verses from the first chapter of Genesis. On Christmas Eve, the crew read verses, and this was audio. It was part of their telecast, one of their telecasts. So a live telecast on Christmas Eve, the crew read verses from the first chapter of Genesis. And when they got done, actually this was a little video too. When they got done, they wished viewers good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you. All of you on the good earth. And where are they at? In the vicinity of the moon. Would that be interesting? So on Christmas Eve, the crew read verses from the first chapter of Genesis and wished the viewers good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Do we need that quote?
No. The re-entry speed of Apollo 8 was 24,696 miles per hour. As they headed towards splashdown in the Pacific Ocean, that command module was traveling 24,696 miles an hour. 24,696 miles an hour.
It's like Mach 50.
It's fast, yeah. It splashed down in the Pacific Ocean at 10:51 a.m., again Eastern Standard Time. Splashed down in the Pacific Ocean at 10:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 27th, 1968. So it was in space over 6 days, right? So Apollo 8 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean at 10:51 a.m., again Eastern Standard Time, on December 27th, 1968. The capsule was picked up by the USS Yorktown, about 5,000 yards from the recovery ship, which wasn't too bad. So the splashdown was approximately 5,000 yards from the recovery ship, which was the USS Yorktown. And it splashed down 147 hours after launch, precisely on time. Exactly on time as expected. So the splashdown was approximately 5,000 yards from the recovery ship, which was the USS Yorktown, and they splashed down 147 hours after launch, precisely on time. Why is it important I emphasize that? Because that gives us great confidence for what? Apollo 11, okay? So they splashed down at what time? They actually reached the recovery ship at 12:20 p.m. It took them that long because they were about 3 miles off, right? Not quite 2 miles off. So they reached the recovery ship at 12:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you know how many orbits they did around the moon? 10. Did 10 orbits around the moon. The spacecraft operated exactly how it was supposed to. So in NASA history, Apollo 8 was performed absolutely perfectly. And without Apollo 8, you have no Apollo 11. Okay? Now I'll tell you a little preview here. Who's the first man landed on the moon? Who stood on the moon first? Neil Armstrong, right? One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Frank Borman was given the opportunity, the first man to land on the moon and set foot on the moon. He was given that opportunity by NASA. Anybody know why he turned it down? Who would turn down such a thing? What? Well, he didn't think he was, but who thought he might have put enough risk on him? His wife. Let's go. His wife. Frank Borman, I'll tell you a story about Frank. Frank lives near Hysham, Montana right now, which is about 75 miles east of Billings, Montana. He has a ranch there. His wife, it's kind of a Mike Mansfield story. His wife has Alzheimer's, which is very unfortunate. And he drives every day to Billings, every single day to Billings, and has lunch with her every day. So Mrs. Borman watched her husband go up in Gemini 7, dangerous. Watched her husband go up in Apollo 8, dangerous. And he decided he had put her in enough stress, and he turned down the opportunity to be the first man to land on the moon. Because you know what he said? Karen, you might appreciate this, you're kind of into football. It doesn't matter who scores the touchdown, it matters who got us there. That was his description. Okay? He didn't need to score the touchdown and be the first man on the moon because he felt he had paved the way to get him to the goal line. He used a football metaphor. Okay? All right, good job. Let's talk about our future here.